West Side Party people, this is John Cole coming back at you with all things chess. We're continuing our roundup of isolated queen pawns. This will be our second reviewing of concepts of how to fight with an isolated pawn. This is a somewhat well-known game. This is Miguel Najdorf versus Najdorf-Reshevsky. Just a brief background on the players. This match was played in 1953. This was sort of an unofficial champion of the free world match. This is the stretch of time where the Soviets were just completely dominant over world chess. So winning the world title away from Botvinnik and Smyslov and Tal, the other players that held a stranglehold on that title, wasn't really feasible for Western players, since one practical reason, they didn't have the Soviet machine behind them providing opening analysis, preparation, and all sorts of resources. Najdorf-Reshevsky especially, really sort of a tragic figure in chess. He, along with Keres and Korchnoi, are often named as the best players to never win the world championship. I think Reshevsky had a little bit less claim to that title than either Keres or Korchnoi. I think Reshevsky had very clear weaknesses in his game. He regularly got into time trouble, and his grasp on opening theory was extraordinarily weak. But still, his natural talent was just absurd. He was a Mozart-like prodigy at the game at a very young age. But then had to grow up and get a job and get into the real world. So his chess forays were limited to his free weekends away from his job as an accountant. That was his actual trade. But when he was able to play, he proved himself to be very naturally talented and one of the best players of all time. But this was their match. Reshevsky won this match very narrowly. Reshevsky was black here, Najdorf was white. d4, knight f6, c4, so he reads, yeah. Nimzo-Indian, e3, this is the Rubinstein, sort of I would say the most popular choice against the Nimzo-Indian. Also, one of the most likely to lead to an isolated pawn structure against the Nimzo. Bishop 3, c5. This is all theory so far, and this is really one of the biggest tabias. It's the biggest tabia in the Nimzo-Indian, certainly one of the biggest tabias in all of chess. There are numerous transitional opportunities from this position, numerous options for both sides. It's sort of a mark of a class of a player and how well they handle this sort of position. World champions all throughout history have handled both sides of this position. Reshevsky chose knight c6. This is the main move. It's the most popular. I wouldn't say necessarily the best move. It's sort of a matter of taste. dx-c4 is another popular choice. This is one I play frequently often. Knight bd7. This is one of many options here, but this is sometimes called the Parma variation. I like this for black. Basically, your goal is to head towards a hanging pawn structure, where you've managed to trade off your Nimzo bishop on b4 to create a weakness in white's pawn structure, and then you sort of develop flexibly from there. The main line of this, just to show real quick. And this is basically, both sides have what they were looking for. White has the bishop pair, a little bit of edge and space and aggressive intentions. Black has a sounder pawn structure. So it's just a fight from here. Another interesting line, much more theoretically dense. This is called the Karpov. I would say this is the top choice in modern GM play from this position. By that dint, it sort of makes it unsuitable for weekend Swiss players looking to win. If you're playing against a theoretically prepared player who has the white pieces and they don't mind a draw, there's a lot of forced draws from this position. Plus, there's just so much theory to manage. So not objectively a bad move, just a very imposing choice to take ownership of. Knight c6, most flexible move. a3, dx-c4. This is sort of the sign of the theory of the time. This isn't the best move at all. The two main options here, taken in c3 is the most natural choice. And then black can either play dx-c4 or queen c7. Both are fine. I personally prefer queen c7. Generally, I like to keep the tension in the center intact and to make my opponent make all the difficult choices about structures. But both are fine. This is sort of a Cadillac of openings. World champions have handled both sides of the board. It's sort of a mark of your class and how well you handle this position. It's the bishop pair against black slightly sounder pawn structure. Sort of the whole story of the Nimzo-Indian in a nutshell. Bishop a5. Instead of taking on c3, this is called the Reykjavik, so named for Fischer's use of this line in his 72 match against Spassky. This is a little bit more sharp. It's less theoretically dense for sure, just because it's far less popular. There's really only one main line, and I'll show that real quick. Bishop g4, c4. When you have the bishop pair, you want to open up the position. 95. And this is a very complicated position. There's two main moves here for white. Bishop b2 and cx d5. Both are fine. I would say black is perfectly fine here. Black has good compensation for the pawn. Basically, he's going to ruin white's kingside pawn structure. He's often going to reclaim his pawn on c5. And then at that point, it'll be white's bishop pair against black's center pawn structure, which, again, that's the whole story of the Nimzo-Indian in a nutshell. So, very interesting. And that's really the only main line in this position. If white plays any other pass move, like an h3, you can go for an isolated queen pawn where arguably black's a little bit more comfortable than otherwise, because this bishop can actually drop back to b6 and help directly pressure the isolated queen pawn. So both are interesting. I like bishop a5 just because I enjoy avoiding the big theory when I can. And this certainly does a great job of avoiding the big theory because it really has only one main line. But in the game, black played dxc4, which definitely is the best move. Bishop xc4 was played. This is far too routine. Neither Najdorf or Reshevsky were really known for their depth of opening preparation, and sort of shows in this game. Modern choice, and this is why taking on c4 is frowned upon. Just take the bishop pair. Take. And this is a very nice position for white. He's got the bishop pair. He doesn't have any pawn weaknesses, so black doesn't have the usual Nimzo compensation for the bishop pair. And this queen-sided pawn duo is actually a little bit mobile and can shoot up the board against its space. So white is clearly at least slightly better here. But after bishop takes on c4, we're just back to the main line, more or less. ed, bishop e7. Also note, black could have taken, or just dropped back to a5 and temporized. Then if white chooses to take on c5, then the black bishop takes on c3 to ruin his white pawn structure. Otherwise, sort of the goal from this would be to gain a hanging pawn structure. And once we start a hanging pawn structure, a video series will talk a little bit more about this. But oftentimes the Nimzo, black is the one that has the choice whether he wants to play against an isolated queen pawn or a hanging pawn structure, which gives black a lot of positional flexibility. But here, black chooses to play against the isolated queen pawn. Again, bishop xc3 would be the choice if you wanted to go against the hanging pawns. In this situation, I think it's the best, because by dropping back to e7, basically black has played bishop b4 and then spent another tempo to drop back to e7. That would be a gain if we somehow induced a weakness from white, or white was forced to make a move that doesn't really fit with the isolated queen pawn scheme, but all of white's moves make sense. a3 even fits because it helps prevent knight b4. Otherwise, white really hasn't been forced to lose any time, other than losing time taking back on c4. So bishop e7, it's standard, but it also does represent a real loss of time that we shouldn't ignore. So I do think white is slightly better here, almost because of that loss of time. So rook e1, b6. This is sort of a branching point where we can look at a lot of different isolated queen pawn themes. What was chosen in the game is bishop f4. This is a little bit non-standard place for the bishop and isolated queen pawn. Basically, Najdorf is looking for speed of development rather than necessarily getting all the pieces where they exactly belong. Bishop a2 would be sort of a more normal. This is a more isolated queen pawn structure. You know, the bishop's reserving itself to go to g5, which is a more normal square. You know, the bishop can drop to b1 to create that battery. White scores very well from this position, but the engine think this is completely equal. So I'm not really sure what to make of it. Because the bishop being on f4, really, it doesn't contribute anything to the thematic isolated queen pawn plans, but it is just development. So maybe the speed of development here matters a little bit more than the quality of development. D5, Again, whenever you're playing with the isolated pawn, d5 you want to keep on your radar and analyze at all times to see whether it's favorable or not to liquidate the isolated pawns off the board and open things up. Here it's not, objectively it's not especially dangerous, but white scores incredibly well for this position. So just a quick, not a5 is the main line, just a quick examination of exd5. And after queen h5, white is at least slightly better here, but I think practically black's position is incredibly difficult. The pawn structure is symmetrical, so the only factor in this game is white's superior mobilization. White has a very good chance of kingside attack just because this queen in h5 is helping pressure f7 with this very dangerous bishop on c4. Objectively, this is only slightly better for white, but practically this is incredibly dangerous. White has won some very striking victories from this position. Knight a5 is probably objectively better, just avoids all that. Bishop a2, knight d5. exd5 doesn't just transpose b4 is a meaningful change. This is just one line. You can look at the notes for the other variations, but this is the line I gave. But white's going to win a pawn, and he'll be much better. So knight d5 is best. And this is sort of the main line after d5. White has a nominal edge here. His pieces are a little bit better, and he's a little bit better mobilized, but white scores incredibly well from here. So if you're looking for a chance to squeeze water out of a stone, this would be the sort of position for you. White will never, ever lose this position. And according to the database, he scores about 60%, which is a little bit above average for your average position. So if you like squeezing out of an endgame, this is a completely no-risk option for whites. The choice of Najdorf is probably what I would do. Just keep tension in the position and keep developing. Bishop e7, bishop a2, standard, dropping back the bishop to go to b1 at some point. Rook c8. We've seen time and again that rook c8 just isn't meaningful in these isolated queen pawn positions. White's threatening to start building up in the king side. Black's already solved his light squared bishop, so the thing that black needs to resolve is the king side pressure that's coming. That's his goal. His goal isn't to play on the c-file. The c-file is not even open, so it's not even a game for him to put a rook on the c-file. So this is just a lackadaisical move. This is far too routine. So queen d3, preparing the battery, very common sense. Queen d7. This is an outright serious error. Rook c8 was just sort of a bit of a drift, but this is putting black on the edge. White has very clear threats. He's just going to build up with rook a d1 and bishop e1 and just start with the kingside attack. Queen d7 doesn't do anything to resolve that. Black's not feeling the danger of the position. Bishop d6 at least challenges White's attacking mechanism. It sort of underlines a drawback of having the bishop on f4 because bishop d6 comes with tempo. It forces White to respond to Black's threat instead of continuing to build. So bishop g5, knight e7. Black's going to throw his knight in the way of the battery. That's how he's going to resolve that. Best is just to take an f6. And White's no longer going to win with a vicious kingside attack, but this is a pleasant position for White. He's got a much better piece mobilization. He's got a weak kingside pawn structure to work against. Black's not without his chances, though. Black does have the bishop pair, and he still has a d-pawn to work against. On balance, though, I would certainly take White every time, but this is still a fight. Notice instead of bishop f6, bishop x f6, if White just continues mechanically, this is actually better for White at this point, or better for Black at this point. This has gone too far. But queen d7 just allows the build-up with no blowback at all. So rook a d1, very clearly threatening something like d5 breaking through with White's superior piece play. So Black probably makes the best practical choice, knight d5, just mechanically blocking the d-pawn push. If he plays something like rook c d8, that's another waste of time after rook c8. You encourage g6, and then the bishop goes immediately back to its natural diagonal. Remember, when you play bishop e1 and queen d3, you're encouraging g6, but after that, unless you're achieving h4 and h5, the bishop's natural diagonal is the a2 to g8 diagonal. That's its natural diagonal that it wants to be on. So unless you're getting h4, h5 in, the bishop really doesn't belong in b1 anymore after you've achieved invoking g6 from black. But black mechanically blocks the d5, push knight d5. Bishop e1, knight x d5 is another option. It might be a little bit better. Here, white's happy to go into a symmetrical structure because his piece play is far superior. Typically, when you have a symmetrical pawn structure, if you have superior piece play, that's going to be the only factor in the position, and that makes it that much more strong that you do have that superior piece play. This is just one of many lines, but something like this. White has a strictly superior game here. He has edge in space, he has superior piece play. This is a very nice position for white. Bishop e1, it's not terrible, but going into the symmetrical structure would have no risk and nothing but reward for white. G6, forced to stop the mate. Bishop h6, shooing the rook away. Knight e4, this is a mistake. Knight e4 doesn't actually accomplish anything. All of these squares are well defended. The knight's actually superior on c3 because it's pressuring the d5 outpost. Superior for white would be knight e5, and then queen h3. In these isolated queen-pawn structures, we've seen time and again that getting your queen to h3 is very strong because you're pressuring that potentially weak e6 pawn, especially if black has spent time putting his bishop on b7. Getting that queen to h3 is a huge gain because, especially once you shoot the rook to e8, the f7 pawn is weak, which makes the e6 pawn weak. So here, white is already threatening knight x f7, and it's difficult to meet that without other concessions. So white would have a very dangerous attacking position here with really no risk. Whereas knight e4, the knight just doesn't accomplish anything on e4. So it gives black more time to defend, more or less. So bishop f8, bishop x f8. This is another thematic error. When you have the isolated queen pawn, you don't want to be trading off minor pieces. That's what black wants to accomplish. He wants to get minor pieces off the board because it makes the kingside attack that much less dangerous. Bishop d2 is a retreat, but it at least keeps pieces on the board. And then white can sort of try to regroup, maybe play h4, h5, try to keep storming the kingside. He's only slightly better at this point, but he still has kingside pressure to work with. But trading just sort of starts to take the wind out of his sails. Bait, knight e5, queen e7. This is a mistake in return. This is way too passive. Whenever you're playing against the isolated pawn and defending against the kingside attack, you want to try to create counter threats. You don't want to just let your opponent build at leisure. Create threats that he has to respond to. Queen c7, it at least hits the knight on e5, so white has to do something. So queen g3 defends it. Knight c7. This is probably about equal. The knight's going to come to f5. Ultimately, in isolated queen pawns, that's always a good place for the knight because it combines attack with defense. Then on f5 helps shore up the kingside, also aims right at the weak d4 pawn. Whereas queen e7, this is completely passive, so it allows white to build with no roadblocks. So queen g3, knight g5, bishop a2 is probably better. Again, once you've encouraged g6, the bishop really belongs more in this diagonal. But knight g, it's not terrible, just bishop a2 would improve white's pieces. Knight f6. Notice f6 just isn't an option here because it's something like knight x c6. This is completely crushing. So knight f6 has to be played. Queen h4. This is an outright error, and this allows further liquidations. Again, when you're playing with the isolated pawn, you want to play aggressively. You want to try to break through at all costs, because in the long term, you've got that weakness on d4 that you don't want to deal with in an endgame. So you have to try to break the kingside open while you still can. Knight x c7 is one potential line. This is just one potential line that I fleshed out. It's not exclusive, but sort of illustrative of what white is looking for. And this is about equal. White's got two pieces for the rook and the pawn, but black also has a weak king to deal with, so this is just about equal, maybe a little bit better for white, but I would certainly say this is headed for a draw. Whereas after queen h4, knight x c5, rook x e5, this is another mistake. it's just heading more towards an ending where this weak d4 pawn is more and more meaningful. DXE5 is better. And just another... Again, this isn't exclusive, just an illustrative line. But a lot of this is actually forced. Knight h5 prevents the mate. Queen d7 hits the bishop, so the bishop has to move. Queen d2 hits the bishop again. Knight c6, pleasant tactical shot. And white gets his way to perpetual. Which would be a good outcome for white, because the closer you get to the endgame, the more white wants to bail out if he has those pawn weaknesses. Whereas after rook xe5, now we've got two sets of minor pieces off the board. And white does have some practical kingside pressure, but it's not breaking through yet. Queen d6, rook e3, redeploying the rook to h3. And the note I gave here, white survived the pressure and traded some pieces off, and black is simply better here. But even practically, these positions are always difficult to defend, because white still has plenty of pieces pointed at the king side. He's got his queen, his knight, rook on e3, bishop can redeploy to a2 if it needs to. Practically, attacking is always easier than defending. Always. Psychologically and objectively. So even when black has survived, or the side playing against the isolated queen pawn has survived the first wave, if you've managed to generate some kingside pressure, a lot of times practically that can still break through, just because it is that hard to keep in a defensive mindset and stay solid. King g7, doesn't want h6 to be blockaded. Rook h8, and this is already a mistake. Black is going to be sealing off 5 points of material in the corner for no reason whatsoever. Black should simply play h5, of course. That stops the mate threat. Actually gives the knight a good outpost square in g4 to use. And it doesn't seal the rook away. Rook g3, rook d7. Black's completely solid. Now he can just continue to build against the isolated queen pawn. Very simple. Bishop a2, again, once you've encouraged g6, the bishop really belongs in this diagonal. You don't want it sitting on that other diagonal forever. 8, queen h4, king g7. And again, even a fairly trivial defense from an all-time great of Reshevsky, it's hard. It's hard to make defensive choices in a position like this. King g7 is just a flat-out error. Queen e7, queen h6, and then black can choose to repeat, or you can try to build with rook d7. Black is fine, but practically it's always easier to attack than defense. So king g7 simply gets hit with bishop e6. Simple tactic. If you'd showed this position to Reshevsky as a white to play and win, he would have seen the tactic. But in the heat of a game, you miss the bishop xe6 tactic because you're thinking about other defensive options. 3-5. There is one sharper wave continuing. Knight f7. This is pretty much decisive. Knight xe6. This is a very clever point. The black queen's completely trapped. So black has to contort himself even further. And white has an overwhelming advantage. But practically, one note, they're probably in time pressure here. Back in the olden days, nowadays young folk, and this is my chance to sound old, young folk are spoiled with single time control games. It used to be back in the day that each side might have like 2 or 2.5 hours for the first 40 moves, and then after each side made their 40th move, each side would receive another hour to finish the rest of the game. So a lot of times in olden games, once you reach the low 30s in moves or the mid 30s, you'll see a lot more errors just because one or both sides might be in time trouble, especially Reshevsky, who was just a time trouble addict. He would take an hour over a simple opening decision and just consistently get in miserable time trouble, which another reason why I never made it to the top. But yeah, I think some of these decisions are influenced by the fact that they're in time trouble. If this position were arriving at move 12 somehow, or Najdorf had a full hour and a half at this point, he might have found the shot. But when you're up a pawn and you're heading for an endgame, bishop d5 is just a natural move. So this is something to note. A lot of times when experienced players were getting closer to time control, the superior side would repeat moves to try to get closer to time control. But unless I'm counting wrong, this is a 3-time repetition. Yeah, unless I'm counting wrong, but end of move 31, end of move 33, end of move 35. I'm guessing because Reshevsky might have been in such severe time trouble that he didn't notice to claim it, or the notation is somehow flawed in the database. I'm guessing the former, because if I had just a guess from looking at Reshevsky's games, Reshevsky might have been down to literal seconds at this point, so he didn't notice to claim it. So knight f3, it avoids the 3-time repetition. Queen d6. This is a mistake. I'm going to just do brief notes from this point because this is far afield from the isolated queen-pawn subjects, but that was an error. H5, that is a mistake. And then after rook e7, this is completely collapsing for white. I'll just give the rest of the moves quickly, but with that much firepower in the 7th, this position is gone. Cute move. Rook can't be taken because of queen x e6 with mate. And then this is just completely gone. And Reshevsky finally resigns. So I wanted to give this game because I think it's far more representative of a real tough isolated queen-pawn fight than sort of an idealized game like we saw previously where white can just tee off and all the sacrifices fit together. This is much more representative of what you'll be experiencing in your games. Just a tough, isolated queen-pawn fight where both sides don't necessarily make the best moves. And white gets an idealized attacking structure from here, but he sort of botches it around. He doesn't choose the most aggressive moves. Especially here, knight e5 was just strictly superior. And then white really gets an ideal attacking structure from this point. But after knight e4, white basically drifts. This is just sort of a fairly equal position. But aggressive chess almost always pays off. Even in this position where black is strictly better. Defending is hard. And as soon white still has this battery against the h-pawn. He's got that aggressive knight on g5. He's got the bishop aiming at the king side. That's still a lot of firepower. So don't play your isolated queen pawns passively. Play it aggressively. Aggressive chess almost always pays off. If you compliantly trade down with an isolated pawn, like we saw in the Petrosian-Botvinnik game, that's when the isolated pawn really starts to hurt you. If you play aggressively, go after the king and create pressure, you're almost always going to be rewarded, even just practically, because it is so difficult to defend even simple positions. You know, in this position here, an all-time great, just flat out misses the loss of a pawn. So really, other than the thematic subjects in the game, the moral you want to take from this is play aggressively. Don't play passively, especially when you have an isolated pawn. Just stay aggressive, generate that pressure. You're almost always going to see rewards from it. So, representative game of an isolated queen pawn fight. I think tomorrow we're going to do our last isolated queen pawn video of how to play with an isolated pawn when we'll review, and then we'll do a final roundup where we just talk about the concepts and I give you sort of a list of things to look out for. But my name is John, also Cybertal, and I'll see you then.